Monster Professor.
Welcome to the Monster Professor, a show in which we discuss and explore monsters in literature, myth, film, games, theater, folklore, culture, and beyond. I'm your host, Josh Woods, author, editor, professor, and monster expert. Just a really quick housekeeping note today. My novel, The Black Palace, is now available at non-Amazon booksellers. Up until now, it's been exclusively through Amazon, but now you can find it through any bookseller you wish to order it through. And you can find my book of collection of short stories, Oh Monstrous World, in all sorts of places, even Target and Walmart, which seems odd to me, but anyway, it's there. Check it out. And you can find out more about my projects or get the podcast directly at my website, joshwoodsauthor.com. And wherever you're listening to us, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, you name it. Give us a like, give us a subscription. It helps us out. Today, I get to talk cosmic horror with a really cool author and a smart, could I call him a horror philosopher? I think perhaps I can. Simon Strantzas. He's the author of, well, all sorts of books. I'm going to run through as many as I can. Nothing is Everything, 2018. Burnt Black Suns, 2014. Nightingale Songs, 2011. Cold to the Touch, 2009. Beneath the Surface, 2008. He's editor of Aikman's Heirs, Shadow's Edge, guest editor of the year's Best Weird Fiction, Volume 3. Awards, he's been finalist for 4 Shirley Jackson Awards, 2 British Fantasy Awards, and World Fantasy Award. He's had his stories reprinted in Best New Horror, Best Horror of the Year, Year's Best Weird Fiction, Year's Best Dark Fantasy and Horror. He's been published all over the place. That's about as many accolades as anybody could fit on a CV. He's an accomplished fellow, and I know him through his work with this excellent journal, Thinking Horror. And it's only a few volumes in. It's still pretty new, and it is absolutely worth a read. And so I highly recommend it. Check that out, Thinking Horror. You can find that. You can find it on Amazon. That's where I bought my copies. But you can find it all over the place as well. I'm going to include links to all of this in the description of the episode. In this conversation, we get into what is up with cosmic horror and why is it that we can fear the universe as monster? Or how do we work that into fiction? How is that? How does that show up in fiction? How does that work? What's the difference between a weird story and a strange story? What's the difference between the cosmic and the personal? We get into all of that and more. I really enjoyed it. I hope you do too. Let's go. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast, Simon Strantzas.
Thanks for having me.
Really excited to talk to you, and I first really started finding out about you through your involvement with this journal, Thinking Horror, and then I found this fantastic interview you did, and then I found your fiction and got into that. I know most people might already know you from your fiction and editing and then found out about your involvement elsewhere, but I was kind of backward on that. And so I was really fascinated with your approach to a lot of these ideas that we play with in horror, in literature, and weird fiction. So I thought maybe we could link that a little bit to some of your background. Maybe we could begin with a little bit of your background. What got you into your fiction writing, and what got you into that dark and weird direction of all places you could have gone? And then maybe a little bit about your editing and your involvement with Thinking Horror.
Sure, that's a lot on that list. I'll try and remember. So I guess I started I guess I started getting into horror fiction somewhere in my teenage years. I mean, before that, I'd always been interested in fantastic things, but in terms, and I've read a lot of comic books. That's pretty much where everything first starts for me. As I read comic books, I gravitated. I shifted away from things like the typical Western superhero comics to more of the alternative comics, like the DC's Vertigo series, and like everyone else at that time into that sort of thing, I was interested in the Sandman comics by Neil Gaiman.
Yeah.
And I don't know which issue it was, but in one of the letters columns, back when they had them in comics, there was Neil mentioned this author, Clive Barker, that might be interesting to read. So I thought, hey, you know what? I have my school exams coming up, but I'll try this Clive Barker fellow out. It sounded interesting, sort of like a monster superhero kind of story. So I went out to the local chain bookstore and I bought a copy of Cabal. I brought it home. I started reading a couple pages before I started doing schoolwork, and 6 hours later I was done. I'd read the whole thing in one sitting. I'd never experienced that before. And, it just sort of spiraled downward from there, I suppose. So that's where my start in the horror world began. In terms of writing, I've always been creative. I always wanted to write or to draw. I was going to be a comic book artist for a while, or at least that was my dream. But that didn't work out so well. When I was in my late 20s, I decided, I needed to focus on something. And I decided writing was going to be what I focused on. And, it kind of led me here. In terms of thinking horror, after I've been writing for a while, I started to, I found myself really, very often at least, just thinking about the horror genre. And I would be on social media asking questions like what people thought of horror, what does this mean, what does that mean? And those sort of navel-gazy college student around the campfire questions, some people gravitated them and they had a lot to say. A lot of people thought, who cares about parsing out these little details about the horror genre? Just, write what you want to write and enjoy it. But for me, that's where a lot of my interest came from for the genre. I like understanding the nuts and bolts and how it all works together and thinking about it. And I'd find myself just, dwelling on these questions, wondering what my contemporaries, how they would answer, the question of why horror means to them, not just in a superficial way, but getting into the nitty-gritty. And while sort of exploring this, I started talking to my friend S.J. Bagley, and they had an idea of a journal as well, where they would interview different writers and ask similar questions. And then one day I had a moment of epiphany, I suppose, and I thought, my idea of a journal with essays and SJ's journal about interviews, they would work great as a single journal. So I approached him and I said, what do you think of this idea? SJ thought it was a great idea. We got our heads together and, Thinking Horror was the result of it.
Yeah, and it's an excellent journal as well. And I'm struck by just hearing a brief review of your background and how many of those were similar to my experience. I started off wanting to be an artist or an animator, and then was constantly obsessed with fantastical and horrific stories when I should have instead been focused on school. Did you ever get in trouble for for writing horror stuff in school instead of working on your schoolwork?
No, when I really started exploring horror was probably at the end of my high school career. So it didn't really come up a lot. When I did creative writing at school, it was more of the surreal sort of fiction. I'd read a comic book series. I don't know if I'm not familiar with comics, but there was one called Beautiful Stories for Ugly Children. And
No, I don't know that one.
yeah, it was a great series. And the writer of that, which I believe was Dan Sweetman, though he may have been the artist for it. I can't remember who did what, Dave and Dan. They were, these sort of very surreal sort of stories, like a family who encounters this pure being of love, and this being looks like a small worm, and they're basically trying to kill it for the entire story. But this worm has nothing but endless love for these people and love for everything. And just sort of, weird sort of stories like that fit in a lot with the current weird fiction scene, especially the sort of fiction I'd like to write now, but just the little less of the horrific element built into it. So I was never really a horror kid. My interest in horror has really been an intellectual interest, I would say, from when I was, pretty much a teenager discovering it, moving forward.
Yeah, and you do a really good job of kind of lifting the hood and looking at the engine about how these kinds of horror stories and weird fiction stories work, and I can't help but be fascinated with it. Like I think at one point in one of the Thinking Horror groups, you posted a question of, how does horror function, or why hasn't anyone really talked about how it precisely functions? And I thought, my God, that's the book I'm working on right now. I got to talk to this guy. We have similar minds. And one of those things you do so well, I think, is kind of clarify how you understand. Well, I think your terms for them were the weird and the strange, and how that's a little bit connected to the cosmic and the personal as it comes to horror stories or weird fiction stories. And I've heard these distinctions made by others, even someone like China Mieville, and no one was ever quite as clear or sharp on it as I think you were, and I think that's really cool. And you embody this in your fiction too, or you make it come to life in at least some of the short stories I've read of yours. So I was curious if you could kind of run us through what you see as the difference between the weird and the strange, or how the cosmic and the personal kind of work in literature and in fiction.
Sure. I mean, I'll preface this, like I always do, with the statement that I think terms like this are great to use to look back on the genre and see what's been written and how it all works together, how it fits in that tapestry of the genre. But I don't think they should be prescriptive. I don't think someone should really write a quote-unquote strange story or a quote-unquote weird story or quote-unquote horror story. I think they should just write what is the truest story to them. And if it happens after the fact to be classified in one of these buckets, that's great. But it shouldn't be the goal, because I find if you write the weird quote-unquote story or the strange quote-unquote story, you end up putting yourself in a box, and you can't really think outside that box. And thinking outside the box is what makes exciting fiction.
Yeah, and as soon as you give writers rules, then all they do is look for ways to break them into. So,
yeah. So, to go back to my definition of the strange and the weird story, which I don't think there's a lot of people who make that definition. It's that difference. I think it's just me for the most part. But for me, the weird story has more of, or at least the weird that I think about, takes more of its influence from the cosmic side of fiction, more of the Lovecraftian side. So you are getting stories that are more about the outer forces working on humanity, whereas I think the strange story is more of a psychological type of story that talks more about what's inside man himself or herself, and it's expressed by the environment that they're in, what's coming towards them from the outside. So it's a slightly different perspective. And I think the weird story is more of an American phenomenon, whereas I think the strange story is more of a British phenomenon, to horribly reduce it.
Yeah, I hadn't really. That's a good point too. I hadn't really kind of pieced together the national origins of it, because I mean, there in some sense there's a lot in horror and the strange that feels like an American invention, kind of like I don't know, kind of like organized crime. It's kind of American,
Yeah.
something like that. So, but yeah,
It's more of about it's more about an attitude towards the fiction, and it's more about the ability to embrace a different side of your personality, of your psychological personality, I guess. The weird, at least the way I'm describing it, is more American because it's more about investigation by a group of people. For example, you have your brilliant doctor who a PhD doctor who goes out and explores some phenomenon on a farm and finds out about the alien monster that's been birthed there. Whereas I think the strange story is more about a hapless clerk going to a mansion, a person the person who lives there happens to be a ghost, that sort of thing.
Maybe there is something in that like American tendency to keep going and pushing west, whatever, no matter how bad of an idea that is,
it's a cowboy mentality.
Yeah, yeah. Who knew that? Okay, so the Western and the cosmic horror have something similar in the soul. Now that does make sense, especially Lovecraft, and I think Poe. Of course, we wouldn't have had Lovecraft had we not had Poe, right? But I think Poe maybe does a little bit of both. But there's something about him that seems a bit old world too. And so we haven't really in the show. We've only talked about it like as a tangent or obliquely. We haven't really focused in on cosmic horror yet, and I've always been wanting to, and we could like spend time only on like Cthulhu or only on Lovecraft, but I was more interested in getting into it with you as just this general idea, because I think you involve it quite a bit in your stories. I think you would agree that you involve the cosmic horror in your stories, and we haven't really. I know a lot of people. I'm trying to figure out the right way to ask this. I know a lot of people who are into weird and the dark and the horrific who just don't get what's up with people like me who like this cosmic horror. Like the universe as monster seems and feels like a legitimate fear or like something quite horrific and fascinating. And I never really could explain what cosmic horror is, like what it's about. Why can the universe be seen as a monster? And so I was hoping you were going to be the man to help me out with this. And so what's your take on what is cosmic horror, or what's at the heart of it, or why or how can the universe itself or existence itself be the monster?
So I think for cosmic horror, it boils down to humanity's tendency to overpower everything. Every time there's a challenge to be met in our world, humans will meet that challenge. Whether it's the tallest mountain or the deepest part of the ocean, the coldest environment or the hottest, humans will find a way to tackle the challenge and come out on top. But you don't come out on top when you're against the universe. You are nothing. You are a speck of dust. Your time in existence is the flicker of an eye in the vast time lines that we work on in a universal time scale. You're nothing. And that idea that you are nothing is impossible to surmount, no matter how hard you try. And this gives us terror. It fills us with terror and awe because there's nothing we can do. There's no way to fight it. There's no way to reason with it. It just is. You are nothing in a universal relative to the universe. And I think that's where the terror of cosmic horror comes from. It's that meaninglessness that it gives your life.
Yeah, I guess if you were ever somebody who stood by the ocean and looked out at what seems like an endless horizon, and you were scared of that, as I was, then maybe you're a cosmic horror person, or even scared thinking about the night sky, like you're afraid you're gonna fall off into it. Because I mean, yeah, werewolves are scary. If you have a silver bullet, or many of them, they're a little less scary, but there's no silver bullet for the universe or all the things that might be there, especially.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, you don't you come, am I right in saying that you come from kind of a technical rationalist background?
Yeah, I would say so.
And so you have I would, and it seems in your fiction as well, kind of a solid grasp on these notions that, well, the further we push science, the scarier this stuff starts to become. It's like we're no longer worrying about all that our own universe that can contain, but perhaps multiple universes, so multiverses and other dimensions are no longer, I don't know, just pure fantasy, to the point where we're thinking it's not so easy for, say, an atheist just to say, "Oh, I'm an atheist." If everything is as big and as vast and as varied as it is, then you don't get to be that safe, do you? Like, anything could be out there, and you seem to play with this idea of of that which creates is this evil thing, or even this demiurge. I'm thinking of maybe like one story of yours in particular about a puppet maker who is like compelled to create these things that he fears and hates, and that are finding ways to like use him to come into existence. And that seems like the old Gnostic kind of demiurge story of maybe we are created by a god who might not be a good thing, who might be a bad thing. So I'm curious about some of your thoughts on this idea of like creation as a dark act, or the creator being a bad thing, or the created turning on that.
Well, I will say that, I guess I'll start by saying at least, that my feelings about the reality that we actually live in are very the rational, material based. I don't, in real life, I don't make room for alternate realities and ESP and any sort of how can I say it, that's not dismissive, but I have a very rational, scientific sort of viewpoint to the way the world works. So when I write stories that are not about that, it's more of me trying to just understand the what if the world isn't as rational and yet as random as I imagine it to be. So it's less that I think of there being an evil maker. It's more of, I think, or I like to explore the idea that the universe itself is malignant, that it's out to get you. I mean, we've all had that feeling at one point or another that, things are stacked against you and the whole world is trying to teach you a lesson or make you pay for something on a karmic scale. And I like to, write stories and think about the idea of what if that were true, what it would be like to live in a malignant universe.
Yeah, and that kind of thing seems a bit connected to a lot of people when they think about horror as a genre. They try to classify it as kind of a conservative or even a reactionary type of thing. I'm thinking like, I don't know, I think even Stephen King went on record to say, horror is by nature conservative and reactionary, and you can see that a lot in a lot of writers. Like, the more you know, the worse things are. Ignorance is a good place to be in, but I don't know how right I am about this, so maybe I'll just frame it as a question rather than say you are this. But do you see horror as a different kind of thing? Because it can also be transgressive or exploratory as well. So what are your thoughts on that?
I think the idea of the horror genre that a lot of people hold, especially people outside the genre, is restrictive. And I don't think it quite encapsulates what I think of horror. One of the problems is, what I call horror is different than what someone else calls horror. And if we're not talking the same language, then we're never going to be able to have a conversation about it. So that poses a challenge discussing this at all. But I don't see horror in terms of these boundaries. I don't see it boxed in that way. For me, it's a much more open space, and it allows in the types of fiction that may be written, there may be classified as different genres into it as well. And I think you can write a story that could just as easily fit into the fantasy genre as it would into the horror genre, but because it's written in a specific way through a specific lens, a specific viewpoint, it becomes a horror story. And I think because of this, you can tackle pretty much any subject through horror because of its use of metaphor a tool that you don't necessarily have in other genres, especially ones that aren't speculative.
Well, what do you mean? What do you mean by that exactly? I'm curious. I think I agree with you, but I'm curious about more like the metaphorical nature of horror that can do more than say other genres.
Well, let's take Cthulhu for example. Right? He is it is. I guess it's not a he.
I think they referred to him as a he at one point, but yeah. I always liked the idea that it was a she, and we just got that part wrong. I don't know.
But Cthulhu himself is a representation of the universe, of the cosmic, of our insignificance. That idea, that being is again is a metaphor, and you don't necessarily have that same tool in your average college literary story. It's about a professor who has cheated on his wife and has to deal with the repercussions of it. They all have the same tools, but the idea of that cosmic insignificance is tackled by horror in a way that other genres can't really do it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That kind of leads where I was wanting to take you next. And so, one version of this question is, well, can this vastness, this cosmic horror of things being so much bigger than us, that even the most important things in our world are meaningless now in the lens of the cosmic horror, can that kind of thing be embodied in a monster? And it sounds like the answer is yes. But you do it in your own fiction, I feel like, and you involve monsters in your stories. So maybe you can give us some insight on how can you encapsulate all the cosmos into one of these beings in your stories, and how is it that you view monsters when you involve them in your stories?
So I don't really feel like I involve monsters that often in my fiction. Maybe I'm wrong and I'm blind to it, but there was at one point an editor was putting together a monster anthology, and I asked for any sort of reprint I might have, and I flipped through all of my stories, and I thought, is there a monster in this one? Is there a monster in this one? And it turns out most of them didn't seem to have monsters, at least the way I think of a monster, which is a character whose main threat is a mortal threat. The Wolfman is a mortal threat, at least on his surface. Dracula is a mortal threat on his surface. It's only the metaphorical threats that we put behind them that make them bigger, or can make them bigger. And I tend to, with my monsters, I guess, focus more on that metaphorical level first, and then I let it trickle down into something that's more solid. But you rarely, I think, maybe hope, I really think that you're going to find a monster who is so that will captivate you on the same level as a Wolfman or a Dracula or whatnot, because they are there primarily as vessels for the metaphorical ideas that I'm trying to get across.
You have, I mean, among your other accolades and your other publications, you're an award-winning editor as well, and you seem to have your finger on the pulse of what's going on with weird fiction and dark fiction. People trying to pull all of this together in their own work, because you not only create it yourself, but you read through a lot of it. And so I'm curious what kinds of things you look for when you're looking for a good, weird, and dark fiction, one worthy of anthologizing, one worthy of putting together with a group of the kind of best fiction in the weird fiction. What kind of things do you look for in a good, weird story?
Wow. Okay. Good question. When I'm reading through stories for an anthology, it's basically about the stories that I like the best. I'm pulling those out. So the anthologies that I edit tend to be very flavored towards the kind of fiction I like, obviously, and I don't think that's probably all that weird of a thing to say or consider. I mean, so the kind of stories that I like, there's a range of fiction that interests me. I like both the more cosmic side of horror. I also like the more personal side of it as well. The kind of horror fiction that deals a lot with tropes, I'm not as big of a fan of. I like to have something that's a little stranger and a little more psychological. But on top of that, I like to see something interesting being done, something I haven't seen before. There's a whole range of horror writers and readers that like the comfort of horror, like it when it's conservative and like to know what they're going to get. I'm more of a reader who likes to be surprised by what they're coming across and see topics handled in a different way than I'm used to seeing them. I like it when it's inventive and transgressive.
Yeah, and you've seen, you've produced a lot, you've seen a lot, and so I'm wondering, where do you think cosmic horror is headed? Like in the stories that are gonna, eventually, if we even get to the year 2025, I'm starting to have my doubts anymore. But
I'm gonna make it to 2021.
Yeah, we might not make it to Christmas or something. But let's just imagine this fantasy world where a civilization continues for another 5, maybe 10 years. Where do you think cosmic horror and fiction and weird fiction is headed now? We've got a lot of technological stuff happening. We got a bunch of crazy social stuff happening. We got pandemics are certainly going to affect things, but you've already been seeing trends even before some of this got crazy. So what would you say as a prediction, or where do you think it's headed?
Well, I think a lot of the low-hanging fruit of cosmic horror has really been picked by now, especially in the last decade or decade and a half. It was sort of a big thing in the mid-2000s to even I guess the mid-2010s, and a lot of the ideas have really been mined by a lot of the authors who are coming up at that point. So I think weird fiction is really, the weird sort of horror fiction is going to start to take a step back from the limelight, and it's only going to be explored by a smaller group of writers. But what I think we're going to see replacing it in the zeitgeist, I guess, of the horror world is this influence of other cultures into horror. Up until now, it's been a very Western world sort of genre. It's driven by the British ghost story and the Southern Gothics, the New York circles and the California circles. And I think what we're going to see is a lot more, non-white, non-gendered fiction start to really encroach into horror fiction and blow it up in a way that no one can really expect. And that's what's exciting about it, is to see these different channels that horror could travel in.
Yeah, that would be cool, because I mean, there's so much cool stuff that is not generally a part of let's say, what seems like the standard Western culture that really could come through in amazing ways. I'm just thinking of something as as obvious as Indra's net, from the Hindu cosmology of this, like, this vast, infinite net, a webbing in which each strand is held together at this jewel that has a perfect reflection of the whole thing, which means you have infinity within infinity within infinity, and that just the thought of that scares me. I think, I don't really know why. It's just a net. I don't know why. But I don't know of anybody, I don't know of the stories or movies that involve that they can. I mean, I guess there's some stuff happening with science. How science and based and technological are you? I'm kind of thinking of the cosmic horror that's come through, and say Alex Garland's The Devs, or the weird kind of stuff they're finding, in the realm of what's really there when we think it's electrons, neutrons, and energy, and then it turns out it's weirder than that. I don't know. Does that kind of stuff scare you as much as it does me?
I don't think it scares me that much. I'm not terribly steeped in it, so maybe if I were, I would be as frightened by it as you are. But I guess with the technological side of things, the scientific side of things, it's more of it appeals more to the rational side of my thinking, and it doesn't really fill me with that terrible awe that something more metaphysical might. Then again, I'm terrified by space, so I guess it's not exactly 100%.
Oh, is it that insignificance? Do people trying to listen to us right now and trying to understand kind of this cosmic fear? I wonder if they're thinking, oh, so you're only worried about not being significant, so it's an ego thing. Like, I don't know if that's all. But I mean, maybe it is all, but just a non-ego way. But is it that insignificance that scares you about space, or what is it exactly?
It's an insignificance, and I guess it's a powerlessness. It's just an inability to. It is the inability to fathom the edge of what's out there. I saw a documentary at a local museum about space, and I think it was about the Hubble telescope, and they talked about the pillars of creation. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the pillars of creation, but they are these giant clouds that birth stars out there in the universe.
They call them the pillars of creation? Wow.
Yes. Yeah, they're beautiful, and they think they were destroyed about 6,000 years ago, but we still see them because obviously it takes a long time for light to get to us. But there are these giant light years long, they look like columns, and again, they are stars are birthed from them. And just the idea that this impossible to imagine distance, this impossible to imagine height of these pillars, that multiple stars can be created from them, and that they've existed for thousands of years and exist for millennia and will continue to exist for millennia, at least as far as we know or we can see. And I'm going to be around for maybe, if I'm lucky, 100 years, more likely like 70 years. Like, that's nothing compared to these things. What do you do with that? Like, how do you live knowing that you're nothing compared to that? I don't understand it. I don't understand how you can go about your day unless you just ignore everything. You put your head down, you just focus on your day-to-day tasks, your car, your mortgage, because the idea of what we live in, the world outside of our little bubble, our little blue marble, is just, it's incomprehensible. And that's what fills me with this terrible awe.
So this is scary. So how do you get through your day, Simon?
Put your head down and focus on the mortgage and the car. I mean, there's nothing else you can do. You just have to forget. It's just like dealing with your mortality. You know, we all know intellectually we're going to die, but if you start focusing on how many years you have left and what you've done and what you're going to do and just what that means to you, it can completely incapacitate you. So you have to push your death out of your mind, and you just think about today and maybe and leave the when am I going to die and how am I going to die and what's it going to be like when I'm dead. You just got to leave that, in a box somewhere in your head and hope it never gets opened.
Yeah, let's try to un-Hamlet ourselves as much as we can. It's harder in 2020, I guess, but I don't know.
Yeah, it's a lot harder.
All right, so maybe I'll hit you with one roughly kind of final monster question or a pair of questions. They're the simplest questions I tend to ask, but but they're the hardest, I think. What would you say is your favorite monster of all time? And or what monster scared you as a child?
That is, as you say, the hardest question. I am not someone who likes to be scared, which is weird for me to be a horror writer. But I didn't come to horror for the chills. I've never really liked being scared. I don't like roller coasters. When I was a kid and a horror movie would come on, I would not watch it. I just don't enjoy the being frightened. So monsters have never really been that interesting to me. They're interesting to me only on that intellectual level of what they could represent. So I mean, when it comes to monsters, I don't know. I mean, I think the Thing, John Carpenter's Thing, is the most interesting of the monsters. I don't know. I mean, a lot of people I hear talk about monsters talk about them in the, I wouldn't say a camp way, but being a fan of Godzilla and being a fan of of the Wolfman or Frankenstein, they're all they're interested in that surface level of the monster, the threat to your mortality level of monster. I don't hear a lot of people, I was going to say I don't hear a lot of people loving Cthulhu, but obviously that's not true. But even them, they're what's appealing to them is that surface level of a giant bat with an octopus face level. I mean, they're not making plushies of the cosmic threat of Cthulhu. They're making plushies because of how he looks. So I don't know. It's hard to answer that question what my favorite monster is because I don't really have one. I mean, I like the worm, the giant caterpillar worm in E.F. Benson's story that I just suddenly blanked on the name of, the vampire worm. Anyway, it's an E.F. Benson story.
Laird Benson, yeah. Thing is, John Carpenter's The Thing is a good one too, because that's the one that kind of works on both levels. It works on that immediate and the physical threat, but it also kind of plays with this infection and this sense of like, is what's real actually real? Like, I think it's real or not, or am I even real kind of thing. So that's an interesting one to bring up.
I think the monsters that appeal most to me are monsters that are born of some sort of juxtaposition. So like the Thing is a bunch of different things all juxtaposed together. The creatures in the film version of Jeff Vandermeer's Annihilation, the bear, the bear monster, skull bear, who screamed like one of the dead scientists. I found that absolutely chilling, and it's that sort of two different animals crossed together sort of idea that intrigues me on an intellectual level.
Yeah, that was a really cool one too because I didn't read the whole series, but I think just Annihilation. It never let me get comfortable with what it was we were dealing with. Like at most, I could brush it off to say, oh, it's some type of mimic alien thing, but I definitely felt like that would be brushing it off, and so, yeah, I think that really made those kinds of creatures scary for me as well when they seem like many things at once and you can't quite pin it down.
Right.
Well, I feel like we tackled this cosmic horror at least enough to kind of clarify for people if they're wondering, well, what's so scary about cosmic horror and what's up with weird fiction as it involves cosmic horror. I think we tackled some of that in a really cool way, and I've used up. Let's call it a success. And I've used up a lot of your time now. I'm really thankful for your generosity on this. As we're kind of winding up, people listening to this are curious in your fiction and your editing and the kind of projects you're up to. So where should we point them? Where can they find out more about your works and find out what you're up to?
Well, I mean, my website obviously exists, and it contains all the information about what I'm doing and what I've done. My website tends to be where I talk most about what I've written and how it came to be. I'm also on Facebook a lot, talking about what my thoughts are, the sort of things that obviously led you to ask these questions of me today. So if this kind of thing you like, Facebook is probably the best place to go for it. On Twitter as well, but on there I tend to just post what I think of as what I try to make funny little bon mots and little asides. So it's not very meaty in terms of what horror means and how it operates.
Very cool. Well, the links to those, as best as I'll be able to put together, you should find, if you're listening to this, in the description of this episode, especially linked to Simon's website. And so I've really enjoyed this conversation, Simon, and I appreciate it, and I thank you for your time on here. So thanks for coming on The Monster Professor.
It was really fun. Thanks for having me.